what is meant about and stay in your houses? Senior figures from the South African clergy seem to say this means women cannot emerge from their homes except in dire circumstances. How would you respond? You see, Hez Jamrock, the thing is, this verse, وَقَرْنَا فِي بُيُوتِكُنَّ, is not... this, first of all, is addressing the wives of the Prophet ﷺ to see to their duties that they have in their household. And whose household are we talking about? The Prophet's household. Okay, because there were a lot of tasks that fell upon the Prophet household, or the prophetic household. And they were to assist the Prophet in conducting these. Did this mean that, لا تخرجنا من بيوتكن? Is that what it meant? It did not mean that. How do we know this? Well, let's examine the lives of the women in the time of the Prophet, including his wives and other women. They were going out and about all the time. They were doing work. They were working in fields. They were, involved in crops. They were buying and selling in the marketplaces. They were conducting their own. And remember, they were in many ways, that society, I know that it's not the right way to use the term liberal, but in terms of gender interaction, they were a lot more liberal than Muslim societies today. They were very there was high gender interaction taking place in the prophetic society. They would pray together, they would be in the marketplaces together, women would conduct their own, they would talk to people, organize their own relationships, their marriages, if they were interested in some. You have to remember, this was a society where relationships were very seen as very kind of just natural. So, women, if they liked men, they would just say so. They would get married, they would get divorced, they would go buy, sell, they would meet people. So you see the woman who comes to the Prophet about sitting her iddah, and she says, "Well, I'm sitting at this, this woman's house at the." I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, but one of the wives of the Prophet ﷺ, or this other woman. But what's important is this lady says, I'm sitting this iddah, this waiting period, following a breakdown of a nikah at this house. So the Prophet says, well, a lot of people come and go there, and I suppose you might need your privacy. So why don't you sit it at the house of Ibn Maktoum? He's blind, and you'll have your privacy and you can have your free space. And so she says, yeah, fine. And the point is that in this hadith, the first house she had selected, the Prophet said, a lot of men come and go there, a lot of men. And it showed the interaction. That's it. Salama, absolutely. Shukran, Abdullah, Mamiyat. So the thing, Mamla, sorry. Now, at Salama's house, a lot of men would come and go. So the point is that this interaction that we see was much more common. So, for example, when the Prophet is, he's coming back somewhere, he's on a camel, and he sees a woman, and he says to her, "Listen, where are you headed?" And she says, "I'm headed back into town, into Medina." And he says, "Well, hop on, I'll give you a lift." And she says, "I'd love to." She was carrying these things. She says, "I'd love to, but my husband, he's just a bit insecure like that." And so the Prophet says, "Well, no, not a problem," and he goes. And the point is that, you see, some men, they were like that, but there was nothing wrong with this. The Prophet wasn't saying anything wrong. It wasn't. So this goes to show that the gender interaction in the time of the Prophet was much more natural and free-flowing than it is today. And you get the example of the person saying that, for example, when he says, he comes to the Prophet and he says, "Oh, look, I've done something wrong," and the Prophet says, "What have you done?" And he says, this woman came to my house, she was selling things, and he says, "Well, I groped her and we kissed and we did all of this," and he says, "But then we just kind of stopped." And you see, now this is interesting, because I know Ibn Hajar in one riwayah says, no, they actually had full-on sex. But in this particular riwayah, he says that we kissed and we groped and stuff like this, and he says, and then she went. Now, and then the Prophet says to him, well, oh, have you prayed? And he says, Salatul Asr, and he says, yes, and he says, well, consider that an expiation for that. And then he does say in one of the riwayah, he says, I hope she wasn't the wife of a person in the path of Allah, that's gone out to kind of get, sacrifice himself for the sake of Allah, and this is what you're doing. But the point is, women were buying and selling, they were trading, they were coming to people's homes, they were doing all of this. The Prophet didn't say, oh right, so what I'm going to do, let me get on the minbar and say, any woman out of her home, God damn you women. He could have done that, but he did not. So what I'm trying to say is, when you look at the picture of Medina, it clearly showed a normal society, not very different from the society we live in today. Except they were obviously great people, companions and so on, but they were still very normal people from that sense. Okay, so